Well, hello again to a bonus York Festival of Ideas event. As the saying doesn't quite go, the first is going to be our last. I'm absolutely thrilled that we've managed to make this date work. The festival runs on a huge amount of goodwill. Our speakers donate their time for free so that we can continue our ethos of educating, entertaining and inspiring. And I cannot think of two women I would rather embody that expression today, with Emily Maitlis and Isabel Berwick. For anyone who has read Airhead, which sort of feels a little bit like being inside Emily's head at the most pressurized moments of her life, I really thoroughly recommend it, and our independent booksellers, Fox Lane Books, will of course be on hand to provide you with access to buying Emily's book afterwards. So The Art of the Interview, the huge thrust of Emily's Airhead book, I really took about 2 seconds to think about the person I most wanted to therefore invite to interview her. And that has to be Isabel Berwick, who is the editor of the Work and Careers section of the Financial Times, who is just utterly fantastic. So I think we're in for a great hour or so of conversation about news, about women in journalism, and about those fantastic interviews that Emily so eloquently describes. Thank you to you, our audience, for sticking with us. This has been an extraordinary year for the festival. We have never done a virtual festival. Ironically, I have been gently stalking Emily since around about 2015, when she was trailing around after Donald Trump in the US, when I wanted her to come and speak and didn't quite manage it. And a virtual world has made that somewhat easier. So I'm truly grateful to you, the audience. I'm truly grateful to the festival team, who have been fantastic in transitioning so much of our program onto an online world. And I'm now going to hand over to the fabulous Isabel for a highly entertaining and probably educational hour with Emily Maitlis. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. I am absolutely delighted to be here talking to Emily Maitlis, the award-winning broadcaster and host of BBC's flagship news programme Newsnight. Emily's career has taken her all over the world, starting off after university in Cambodia, where she made documentaries, and then in Hong Kong, where she worked in radio and TV before coming back to the UK and joining Sky before her long career began at the BBC. And we're here today because last year she published Airhead, about the imperfect art of making news, that title of today's chat. And it's a fantastically vivid account that takes readers right behind the scenes at some of Emily's biggest interviews and outside broadcasts. Some that particularly stuck in my mind were Donald Trump, the Dalai Lama, and Emily in Budapest station during the great migrant crisis of 2015. The updated paperback version I commend to you because it has a chapter about Emily's subsequent award-winning interview with Prince Andrew. Emily, welcome. This is such an honour. We're going to chat for about half an hour, I think, and then I know a lot of people out there have got questions, so I won't take up too much of your time. I'll try and go straight to them. But I'm going to take my own privilege and start with a question I want to ask you, because I can. I'm insanely jealous to see that Airhead has a television deal. Have you been involved in that? Can you give us any more details about that?
Yes, Isabel, it's one of the most exciting things that's going on at the moment, actually. Before I tell you about that, I should just say thank you, and thank you to Joan. And I feel like saying I'm sorry I'm late. So thanks to all the audience for bearing with this session. I don't know whether I feel like saying I'm sorry I'm sort of 6 weeks late or 6 years late, but it's very nice to be here finally. And the Airhead TV series is, I feel, I suppose, ridiculously superstitious about this. I'm sort of I'm touching wood, because it was bought last year, and I hope, within touching distance of signing my writer. And so I would have loved to be able to come on and say it's this, but I think the ink is still wet on the contract at the moment, and so I'm ridiculously always superstitious and nervous about jinxing these things. But hopefully, if we get her, fingers crossed, in the next few days, then then that will all come out. But it was quite a shock, actually, because it sort of grew into something that I never thought it would. The book started with me just saying, I seem to have so much to get off my chest. If I don't write it down now, I'm really worried that I'll forget all the stuff. I won't be able to tell my kids, why I wasn't there at half their Christmas Carol concerts, why the lemon cake that I made for the cake bake sale looked as if the dog had got to it first. It normally had. Why everything in their life was sort of quite awkward when they were little. And, you know, I'd sort of say, bye, darling, see you tonight. And then I'd be gone for 4 days and they'd sort of, you know, just have to get used to that. And so I started writing the book almost as a way of saying, this is what I've been doing. You know, if you ever want to grow up and know where I was, all those odd occasions where you came home from school and your mother was on a plane, sort of in a sort of, you know, horrible sort of terrorist attack in Paris, this is what I was doing. And then it needed sort of lightness and it needed light and shade. And as I wrote, I guess I found it really therapeutic because it allowed me to think with this amazing sense of retrospection about all the things that I just hadn't recognized at the time. I hadn't recognized political shifts as they were happening, but writing about them 3 years on became so much more clear. I hadn't realized that there was sort of joining of dots with certain patterns. I hadn't realized when I was interviewing Donald Trump quite what that would look like from sort of 4 years later or 5 years later when he was actually running for president. And so all these things grew into a different sort of shape. And when I got the call from Working Title saying, I think we want to make it into a TV series, can we buy the rights? I just assumed it was a sort of fake call. You know, I was like, yeah, really funny. Nobody wants to do this. And then it sort of, you know, grew and grew. And the gang there have been quite keen. And there is definitely a nervousness for me about this, because once it becomes their rights and their product and their imagining, they can obviously do whatever they want with the character. So I could be, you know, a sort of an alcoholic kleptomaniac in the book or in the TV series, for all I know. And I just sort of said, if you can do that the character, that's fine. Just, you know, just please don't call her Emily, because at some level I have to carry on working at the same time. But I hope that we're going to be starting work on it in September, and I want to be as involved in that as I can. Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant way to start, because as I was reading it, I felt the immediacy of it. And you alluded to it there, that you wrote it partly for your children, and also the way of explaining to people what goes on behind the scenes. And one thing that really struck me, and I think in journalism generally, this is something we don't talk about enough, is the cock-up versus conspiracy, which people who are not inside journalism or inside baseball, as they say, people often tend to think of things as a conspiracy, and we're in an age now where everything is a conspiracy theory. But I really thought that the rawness and the immediacy of it brought home to me as a reader, but also I hope to many other people, that things are not planned, things are random. And you talk a little bit about something called, I think, is it called the charity theory? It's a Jonathan Chait quote.
It's so, yeah, it's really interesting that Jonathan Haidt is I want to say US, he might be Canadian, he'll kill me if I get this wrong, but I think he's a US academic. And he's written, for example, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he looks very much about the sort of the way we teach and the way we learn. And one of the things that he introduced me to in that is the principle of charity. And it's so interesting that you picked that out, Isabel, because when I heard that, it sort of spoke to my soul in a really bizarrely profound way. And the only way I can explain it is that most of the time, I want to say people don't mean ill. They don't mean bad things. You know, there is not a huge conspiracy of trying to deny this or not do that or not tell you the story of this or whatever. I think, and it's not just in my business, it's, you know, I sort of think it has to be sort of applicable in life. Most people walking down the street, you know, if they yell at you because your dog's gone up to them, you know, and I get very protective of my dog, I have to go, they've probably had a shit day. You know, it's all about that. They've probably had you know, they've learned some terrible piece of news, or they've just had a medical result or whatever. Just step back from it. And I keep thinking, in today's world, we cannot do that enough. You know, you cannot pause enough to kind of go, I wonder if they really, really hated that, or really, you know, were really angry with that, or whether they were just having a sort of bad day. And I suppose the way I apply it in TV is there are so many moving parts to our day, and this isn't an excuse at all, it's literally sort of opening up the Heath Robinson-like contraption that is a sort of a day of Newsnight. There are so many moving parts, so many cogs and wheels and screws and all the rest of it, that the remarkable thing for us is when the wheels don't fall off, you know. So the simplest things come down to, you know, if you're looking at the balance of an interview, I think there's one chapter which is a really delicate moment for me when I'm talking to Rachel Dolezal, who is this woman who got into an extraordinary controversy because she had, self-defined as Black, as African American, and then she was exposed to somebody who was a white woman, and there was a whole question mark over why she'd done that and how she'd done that. And I got the first interview with her that was a sit down, and there was a lot of controversy around it, and there was some sort of really interesting discussion of whether she'd stepped out of line and whether this was about a sort of abusive childhood that she'd gone through and all the rest of it. And we had this perfectly planned interview in the studio, and then one half of the interview got stuck in a cab in Chicago, you know, in roadworks. And you can't explain all these things to your audience, but you're sitting there saying, you know, you're kind of watching the clock and you're hearing this voice in your ear saying, okay, the cab driver picked up, oh no, he's picked up the wrong guest. Oh no, he went to Salisbury instead of Salford. Oh, sorry, you know. And so you're sort of hearing this whole thing and thinking, this is going to look terrible on air. This is going to look terrible on air. We're going to be absolutely shocked for how this comes across. And there are so many moments like that within any working week. And so the principle of charity is something I try to introduce, which goes to exactly your point, that you know, I wish we were genius enough to have the conspiracy, but we're not. So most of the time, these things are just the sort of the clash of 1 minute either side, or somebody getting an address wrong, or an extraordinary moment we had on air, which I described, which was a discussion between two deaf women, which was the first time I think that had ever been done on a sort of mainstream news program. And they had this fantastic discussion using sign language. And we thought we were sort of breaking ground there and doing something that was, you know, just sort of talking to a whole community that we hadn't reached before. And on that particular night, we had these brilliant studio cameramen and women, and the operator on that night sort of zoomed in very closely on the two women's faces, which is obviously, you know, how you capture a good interview and how you sort of bring light and understanding to it. But accidentally, without thinking, cut off their hands. And of course, they were speaking with their hands. They were speaking in sign language. And yet, you know, the idea that the camera operator had ever tried to do that, or had ever sort of thought maliciously, I'm going to stop, you know, these two deaf people from having a platform on Newsnight, is so ludicrous, you know, that you wouldn't even try and think it, but it created a real, you know, a problem. Everything was sort of a problem, and it ended up making us look like we hadn't understood the community that we were talking to. We hadn't sort of got that right. And so all these things are just sort of, there's a sort of fraction of balance between something going brilliantly well and terribly wrong. I suppose that's what it comes down to. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating, because we're sort of in this moment, aren't we, where our learning patterns have been accelerated massively by the moment we're in. And I was particularly struck by your chapter on Grenfell and Theresa May, because that was a moment where she badly misjudged it or had been badly advised. And that very sad episode, I think, perhaps was a turning point for us. And you write very movingly about it from a personal point of view, because I know you live near there and were involved in the community. But also that moment where it became clear that Theresa May had made a catastrophic error by not talking to the people on the ground and the story. Did that change your view of journalism at all, or the way we report? It seemed like quite a pivotal moment for you.
It's a really interesting one. And I suppose in a way I'd sort of look at that phrase and say, was it a catastrophic error? You know, if you apply the principle of charity again, like weirdly, you know, it's so much easier to do this in retrospect. You can say that wasn't her style. You know, she was not a woman who particularly found emotion easy, and so she was probably doing what she what she normally does. She's a doer. She's maybe not an empathizer. She maybe not a sympathizer. You know, somebody like Bill Clinton, you know, we all remember him with the Oklahoma bombings, just finding that tone, being able to speak absolutely brilliantly from the heart. You remember, you know, Obama sort of, do you remember when he burst into song and he did Amazing Grace? I think it was after the Boston shootings. And there was this whole thing, you know, the stuff that makes your spine tingle and the hairs on your neck rise. And that's an extraordinary quality to have. But I suppose part of me thinks, you know, is it fair to sort of dictate that everyone has to have that level of emotion? And maybe that wasn't her strength. She was practical. She's a sort of, I think she's, you know, she arranges flowers, she cooks a good, you know, hot pot. She's a sort of different kind of person. And I suppose the question I asked myself in that chapter was how you straddle the sort of two horses, as it were, because when Grenfell happened, as you said, you're absolutely right. I'd been working, volunteering, because it feels like my kids hate it when I say my hood, but you know what I mean, my neighborhood, literally. And so my first response to that day, as to many others who, you know, near and wide, had been, right, we're going to become the doers, you know. So funny enough, I was the Theresa May in a way that day. I was like, I need bags, I need sort of towels, I need efficiency, I need children's games, I need sheets, I need pillowcases. I'm going to start doing, because we didn't know what to do with ourselves. We just all felt this horrific sense of I don't know, just the sort of solar plexus just going through you, and sometimes the only way you can sort of work through that is by sort of doing. And so I'd spent the day and the following day sort of down at the sort of refuge centres, just sort of helping pile stuff up and hand stuff out and give lifts to people who needed to be taken, you know, to different accommodation and to hotels and all the rest of it. And then I sort of slipped into the role of the presenter that night. And on the night of Grenfell, I remember standing there and the flames were still going in the tower behind me. And it was one of those days where I had the voice in my ear, and we always obviously try and, you know, balance the voices on air. And if somebody's making claims, then you have to push back and you have to say, oh, well, obviously the council isn't here to defend, or that, you know, you have to always sort of be trying to give that other voice. And there was somebody from the Residents Association who was really passionate and angry and just telling us that residents had been ignored for too long. And I had this voice in my ear saying, oh, you must push back and say that, you know, we don't know that that's true and all the rest of it. And I remember thinking, I can literally see the flames out the corner of my eye. It's really hard at those points. I don't think I can look this survivor and resident in the eye and say, oh, I'm afraid I have to stop you there, because, you know, we need to have balance. Those are the moments where it became very, very complicated, because it was such a close story. And the Theresa May interview happened a couple of days later, and as you said, there had been this sort of chain of errors on her part, or on her advisor's part, where she'd gone to talk to the fire brigade rather than the residents themselves, and she'd essentially been booed out of the place that she was trying to talk to them. And it had looked as if she'd lost just sort of lost the humanity sort of connection there. And in the end, she came to the BBC broadcasting house, and she never meant to do this. I know she meant to just sort of turn up, do one quick bite down the line, or, you know, sort of one quick sound bite, and then hop into her car. And in the end, she came to the BBC because it seemed like, you know, a safe space, as it were, sort of away from the crowds and the protests. And we sat her down, and actually once you've got somebody sitting down, it changes everything majorly, because then they have to actually talk to you and they have to confront the sort of questions. And I remember doing the interview that day, not as a journalist, but as somebody who'd been on the ground, and my phone was literally full of people saying, where should I go for food? You know, can I move back and get my belongings? I don't understand if the building next to it said. So it was a whole different sort of interview. And I think then, you're right, she answered in this very sort of matter of fact. And that was really hard to listen to, because it felt like she still wasn't quite getting it. And I think that's why it was quite a raw emotion. But when I think back on her face, and it's absolutely sort of emblazoned into my memory, she looked wrecked by it. And I have no doubt that she was horrified and haunted and saddened by that. But some people find it, you know, harder to show the emotion. That's not how they're wired. So yes, I suppose, I mean, it was a changing moment for me in many ways, but it was changing because I realized, you know, what happens when you're sort of, we always say, isn't it great to be connected to a story? Of course it is, you know, but sometimes you can be connected in a way that makes it quite, you know, sort of difficult then to sort of step back. Yeah.
It is hard to step back, I think, but I think one of the great things about your book is that, you know, it is you, it feels, you know, in the modern word, authentic, and authenticity is very highly prized, and you come across as very, you know, you're quite hard on yourself sometimes, and sometimes you're quite open about having been hard on your colleagues. Would you say that you've always been like that, or do you think that's a privilege that we, as perhaps more senior women in our roles, grow into? Because I can certainly remember being, you know, I wouldn't say boo to a goose when I was in my 20s in the media. And I'm just thinking about people watching this who are younger and in their careers. You know, is it okay to admit vulnerability and rawness? I'm undecided. I think it works brilliantly for you, but have you always been like that?
Such a good question. I mean, basically, I would say Airhead is literally, you know, a book of my mistakes, you know, the successes as well, but it's a book of all the mistakes. And I think you're right. I have probably been quite hard on myself in the sense, I remember Matthew Dancona, who's a fellow journalist, you're sure, and a friend. And I used to say that every Newsnight shift I finished, I sort of went home and I'd wake up in the middle of the night going, no. And he said, oh my God, you're like this sort of, you know, terrible Amy Winehouse character who just sort of at the middle of every night is no, you know. And I used to do that to myself the whole time. I used to come away saying, oh, I could have asked that, or why didn't I ask that? Or I've just thought of how I should have asked that, or why did I interrupt then? Or why didn't I interrupt then? So I think that there's always been a little bit of that in me. But I think you've said something spot on, which I'd never thought about before. In a way, you have to be at a place where you're confident enough to say, you know, I can do this because I know what I've also done and I know what I've achieved. And it's a bit like, you know, that brilliant phrase my mother always used to say, come, don't be so modest. You're not that great. You know what I mean? It's like, there's a moment where if you joke about something terrible, people will take you seriously and they'll assume that you're absolutely terrible at everything you do. And so I think I had to get to a stage where I could write the book saying, you can weigh up the things that I've done well, but here are also the things that you might not know about that leave me sort of screaming no in my sleep and giving me sort of anxiety pains and all the rest of it. And so I suppose, I mean, I'm really glad this has actually gone out to university, to Kingston University, to sort of the freshest students this week. And one, you know, in the sort of presentation I did for them, I'm quite happy if people can read it and say, yeah, it's, you know, it's not all roses and it doesn't all go smoothly. And I think we're getting better at saying, you know, here are my failures as well. Or maybe that's a very female thing, I don't know. But I think you're right. I wouldn't have dared write any of this 10 years ago. That's absolutely right.
I think the culture has changed as well. And that's something you've talked about a lot on Newsnight in your report, you know, the Me Too movement and more recently the Black Lives Matter. And I'm just thinking, looking back on your experience, you know, it feels like we're in a new spin dryer. You know, some crazy story happens every week, but do you now have a good sense of what's going to stick? Because Black Lives Matter feels like a moment now, and Me Too did at the time. Do you have a good feel for what you think is passing and what's going to be a real shift?
I honestly, I think that I can still be taken absolutely by surprise and blindsided. I mean, you know, I would have thought, I mean, let me say, I would agree with you that the Me Too movement was an extraordinary moment. But I don't know that I would say it has been a shift. For me, one of the most extraordinary sort of, not culminations, but sort of moments in that whole thing was seeing Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And I would have thought, given everything that we'd seen before, that, sorry, this is kind of baseball stuff. It was the Supreme Court nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, and Christine Blasey Ford came forward and she accused him of, I think it was attempted rape, or it was certainly sexual abuse when she'd been in her teens. And she went through the whole sort of proceedings and she wasn't believed. And I remember thinking at that point, I've still got this completely wrong. I thought that we were now in a place where that story would have been heard and would have changed the outcome, and it didn't. So actually, I don't mean to be cynical, but I would say that I never think, oh yes, tick, that's done. Just like I think we can move backwards just as easily on Black Lives Matter, even though it doesn't feel like that now. I don't think these things necessarily have a momentum of their own, like, oh, that's all done, glad we sorted that one out. I think you have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, because actually there's an extraordinary way in which they can turn around and hit you in the face. I mean, what did we see 2 weeks after Black Lives Matter protests, the counter protests on the streets? So I don't think the direction of travel is these days is actually that obvious. Actually,
no, it can be very bumpy.
Yeah.
I bought the hardback of your book, and so I missed I've had to go back and read elsewhere the chapter on Prince Andrew, which is perhaps allied to some of the things we've been talking about already, and been back in the news this week because Ghislaine Maxwell's been arrested. Looking back on that, it seemed to happen very quickly. It was, arranged quite on, it was but it was a national moment, and you were at the center of that national. I think, everybody was watching that interview. It was an electrifying moment. How does it feel looking back on it now?
I can't quite believe it happened. And I know that sounds really weird, but going back to, the Heath Robinson sort of cogs and wheels, there were so many things that could have gone wrong in the lead up to that, in the execution or in the aftermath, that I still I slightly pinch myself that happened, and it happened as it did. That it did happen very quickly because it was completely under wraps. It was a tiny group. It was the Newsnight team, and it was a small team at Panorama who had worked closely with us. And no one else knew about it. And I'm convinced that if it had got out, it would never have actually happened. It would have sort of got lost in the weeds somewhere. And these things don't sort of start from nowhere. The seed of that was sown actually a year earlier by our sort of bookings editor, Sam McAllister, who'd sort of been off for a chat and had sort of talked to the team at the Palace about a general wide-reaching interview, and they had sort of been quite interested, and these things take time. And then it took about 6 months, I think, and they came back to us in maybe March and said, we'd quite like to go ahead with an interview, send us your list of areas of interest, not questions, but what would you like to talk about? And I think Sam just put together a list of everything, and on it was sort of a bit about the royal family and a bit about his work with the trust, and not the trust, I've forgotten the name now, but anyway, the charitable work he was doing, and a bit about the family, and a bit about work overseas and all the rest of it, just a general thing. And she put the Epstein stuff somewhere in it. And when the list came back, they'd said yes to everything except Epstein. And at the time, you'll remember, this was before the whole sort of Epstein thing had sort of reawakened, rebroken. And we sat and looked at each other and we said, oh, should we just go ahead with it anyway? Because, what is there to ask about Epstein right now? Nothing's happening. And then I think it was our deputy editor, Stuart McLean, just said, I just don't feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable taking things out of the conversation, off the table, I think we have to say no. And we all had this sort of thing of, you know, if they go elsewhere, that's what you're always asking yourself. Do you turn down an interview because it's not going to be good enough, or it's not going to be on the sort of open terms that you want, but you risk losing the interview completely? And we said, how will we feel if he goes elsewhere or does something else? And we basically said, fine, we're gonna take the chance. And so we let it go. And then thank God we did, because actually in July he was arrested. By August, you know, he was dead in a prison cell. We would have felt appalling as journalists if we'd done the sort of the neatened edges version of that, I think, without ever going there. And so it was only much later, in October, that we started talking to the palace again, and we said, look, this story isn't going away, and it's intensified for the Duke of York since the death of Jeffrey Epstein in a prison cell in New York. Will you think about it again? And extraordinarily, they then came back, and it was quite a few meetings. It was a lot of phone calls. It was a lot of email exchanges. It was trips to Buckingham Palace. And then it finally, you know, it was one of those things where it was a very, very slow build up. And then it suddenly was like, it's 2 days' time. And these things are sort of double-edged, because you're willing them on and willing them on and willing them on, and please and please and please, you know, you sort of want the interview to happen. And then somebody says yes, and you get an absolute cold sweat, and you're like, no, I don't want that at all. You know, you sort of want to leave the country, because suddenly the sort of pressure feels enormous. And so it sort of came from nowhere, but actually it was a beast with quite a long tail, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And well, it certainly brought, you know, people who don't sweat and Woking and Pizza Express into the national conversation for a few days, and then it became, you know, really very serious. But speaking of, just looking on the other side of the camera, there'll be lots of people watching, and in fact me too. What would you suggest for people? What have you learned about guests? What have you got to say to people who are potential interviewees? I mean, what's the biggest mistake that people make when they come on the programme? It seems to me sometimes people are trying to say too much or not saying enough. There's an ideal sort of way of portraying things on television, and you're a very expert at it, but many people are very reticent about going on television or being guests. And I think this is particularly true of women, actually. You know, they might be very knowledgeable in their subject, but they say no to Newsnight. I bet you get a lot of no's from very knowledgeable women. Is there anything you can say to people to try to put them at ease, to say, yes, come and make your views known? What's the way to do it?
We always joke that, you know, you call up a sort of NASA scientist who's written her whole thesis on black holes, and you say, hello, you know, we'd love to have you, NASA scientist, to speak about black holes, because we're doing that item tonight. And, you know, quite often, if it, you know, the woman will then say, oh, I'm afraid I can't, but I can introduce you to my, you know, my male colleague who's, you know, who does the zodiacs for the paper or something, you know. And you're kind of like, why do we do that? You know, why do we seem to sort of shun our expertise and sort of as women, and just sort of think that there's always going to be somebody who does that better? And if I'm honest, Isabel, I think I mean, I see both sides. So I do, you know, when I do the interviews and I do the interviewing, one of the chapters I write about in the book is what it's like being interviewed myself when I was talking, you know, on 5 Live, doing a radio interview about a really sort of, I'm not going to go into it, it's the sort of stalking chapter of my life. And actually, the best thing about that was working out how vulnerable you are as an interviewee. And I think it's really good for us to remember that. You know, it's a bit like the nurse that does all the sort of injections in the hospital. Like, each time that person comes to you, they're terrified because they don't like injections. Whereas the nurse is just sitting there going, roll up your sleeve, roll up your sleeve, roll up your sleeve. And so actually, I think it really helps for me to go, this is actually a big ask. You know, I never underestimate that it is a big ask, actually, for people to give up an evening, you know, come into a studio, not put their kids to bed, sit there, you know, getting whatever kind of comments or you know, having to have the equivalent of me going, no, why did I say that? I sat next to at dinner one sort of very well-known historian, he said, I watch Newsnight every night, Emily. I said, oh God, you should come in. You know, why don't you? We should get you on. It'd be lovely. And he was like, no, because I watch it with a whiskey in my hand, and I really enjoy that. And I'm just not prepared to give up my drink and my ability to fluff my words if I want to, you know, rather than come on and be the guest. So I think my advice to people is, you know, on the one hand, obviously I would say this, we're not monsters, and we really want to engage our audience. And if we call you up, it's because we think that you'd be a great fit and have lots to say, and our audience would love to hear it. So that would be the first thing. But the second is, I think we have to be cognizant of actually, you know, it is a big ask, and it's really nice when people can do it and say yes. And I think a lot of people come on, and once they've done it the first time, you know, it's not very scary, it's fine. It is genuinely, you know, fine for 99% of the people who come on. And recently it's been quite funny because we've done so much through Zoom. Once the restrictions were lifted about 3 weeks ago, guests that we could never normally get into the studio were like, yes, I'm coming. They were so happy to get out of their house. And, you know, oh, finally, I'm allowed out. So we had sort of guests come in and say, this is my big night out this week. You know, I've been allowed out of the house. And so it sort of became almost a treat to get back into the studio. And sometimes it's been brilliant, you know, in the sort of the last year, particularly in the Brexit debates and all the rest of it, we had big studio sort of gatherings of sort of 6 or 7 people. And it became a real, you know, there was a sort of must-watch quality and a must-be-there quality, because people love being part of a lineup where they were sort of all having a voice and all managing to sort of be part of that, I suppose, that moment. So, yeah, I mean, there's nothing as a sort of tip that I could say, because it depends so much on what you're there to talk about. You know, I think the frustrating thing is when people come on and you think they're going to say one thing and they completely change their mind and say something else, but you can't legislate for that. You know, you just sort of remember it for next time.
So the joys of live television.
Of course.
And I wanted to talk about, you'd mentioned there about Brexit debates, and that, I think that particular time, that was perhaps when the debate ignited about objectivity, and what we mean by objectivity, and all the stuff that's swirled around, and we've had it a lot at the FT, and I know you have at the BBC. Yeah. And there's a quote from Christiane Amanpour that I really like, and I say to people when I'm having debates with them about journalism, which is that I'm truthful, I'm not neutral. You know, we're all people, and the meaning of objectivity has changed, I think, and is a moving goalpost. And I think there was the issue with Dominic Cummings breaking lockdown, which of course, you know, was an issue on Newsnight a few weeks ago. I mean, that seemed like a massive story at the time. Obviously, we've gone through the spin dryer about 6 times since then. But all of these are really interesting examples of an evolving debate about our role as journalists and your role as a presenter. Looking back on that and all the other things that have happened, where do you stand now about objectivity, truth, neutrality? I guess climate change is another area where this has been very contentious.
I honestly, I think you stand, or I stand, where we've always stand, that, you know, objectivity, impartiality is absolutely central to what we do. And impartiality means you don't show fear or favour, you know, to whoever is in power, to whichever party you're talking to whichever organisation you're talking to. It means that you don't back off a story just because you're fearful of a call from Downing Street, you know, or you're not cowed that they're going to pull your next interview or say something to, you know, embarrass the boss. Because actually the thing that we've come away with is that our viewers massively expect us to follow the integrity of the story. You know, they want us to scrutinise whoever it is in power, whoever it is making the statements, whoever it is that, you know, might be breaking the rules. That's what, and that was the message that came back really clearly over that whole time, that we have to listen to our viewers on this, and our viewers expect us to be journalistically rigorous and fair. And, you know, as long as we feel that that is what we are aiming for and doing, then I think we say, you know, we're providing a service. And when we stop doing that, we might as well pack up and go home, because they'll tell us, you know, our Newsnight viewers, you know, I would say this, wouldn't I? But they're magnificent. They're really smart. They're really engaged. They know bullshit, and they also know, you know, when we're not doing it right. They tell us the whole time. And so I sort of, you know, I would say this, but I trust their gut feeling, and I feel like that has to be our guide. We have to be there to scrutinise. Otherwise, we're not earning the licence fee. We're not doing our job. And you know, they might as well stop watching. We might as well go home.
And on that, in recent years, we've all become much more engaged with our viewers and readers through social media and email and other means. I mean, it can be, I guess, speaking personally, it can be a mixed blessing. But and you've just spoken very powerfully about what the viewers want. How do you? I mean, I know that you get a lot of personal abuse from people. How do you protect yourself from your professional self? I mean, how do you feel it's going on balance? It's a great way to talk to viewers, but are you able to keep some sort of balance in your interactions?
Funnily enough, I don't get that much abuse. Weirdly, I don't feel like I get very much abuse. So maybe I'm just not reading the stuff. I'm sure there's stuff out there. I don't really see it, which is maybe the answer to your question. I get lots and lots of emails, and it's really interesting, actually. I mean, I got hundreds of emails during the Cummings time, which were very reassuring, very supportive and great. And I feel badly, actually, that I didn't even get round to answering most of them, because it was a sort of, you know, crazy time. There's just a lot of inbox, but that was a sort of, you know, an amazingly sort of supportive feeling that I was grateful for. And then you get sort of ones like, it's really interesting. I got one a couple of days ago that just said, oh, I was talking to my gardener and we decided that, you know, it was very funny. It was a chap who wrote to me. He said, I was talking to my gardener and we decided that you rant too much and you interrupt too much and you just go off on one, and you're everything that's wrong with the BBC. And I sort of come back from work, and it was you know, midnight, whatever, 12:30. And I sort of looked at it, and I was, you know, your heart sort of sinks, and I'm like, delete. And then I was like, no, I'm not going to delete. And so I sat down and I wrote a response, and I said, I'm really sorry that you feel that way. It's really important that we hear from our viewers. And I'm, you know, it's interesting that you talk about XYZ, because actually we quite often get told ABC, you know. And so I sort of put this whole thing together, and I tried to be as gracious as I could, you know, principle of charity, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, you know, most of the time you don't change anyone's mind, but you just sort of send it off. Anyway, I sent it off. And the next morning I got, and this time it was Ms. Maitlis, you know, blah, 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 blah. The next morning it's, dear Emily, thank you for your lovely response. I didn't for a moment mean that you weren't this. I've always admired your work and I really love this. But I just, and then he said, but I wonder if you don't interrupt too much. He said, I really, really enjoyed Jeremy Paxman's style. And so then I wrote back again, and I thought, why am I doing this? It's 1 o'clock in the morning. You know, I should be going to bed. I'm exhausted. But at 1 o'clock this morning, I wrote back and I said, dear blah, 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 thank you again for spending the time to sort of talk me through this. And I said, I'm so pleased you love Jeremy Paxman's style, who is, of course, you know, the master of the interruption in the most wonderful, wonderful way. And I said, I wonder whether, I would not presume to say this, but I know my colleagues would suggest, I wonder whether you have considered that there might be a subconscious bias in your, you know, approach to female interviews rather than male interviews. And I said, I don't for a moment presume that it's something that you're, you know, be conscious of, but we find it a lot. And a lot of, you know, female interviewers get told that they're interrupting when they actually, you know, do much less. And again, interestingly enough, that my editors are always yelling in my ear that I don't wind up the interviews enough, that I don't get to the point enough, you know, that I've sort of let things get away. You're constantly trying to balance what people hear versus what, you know, other people want to hear. Anyway, this morning, I got this absolutely charming reply back. It was all about, obviously, his mother and his aunt and his this and his that, you know. So he sort of talked to me about all the women in his life. And then he said, we're huge fans of yours. You know, my wife and I are huge fans, and keep up the good work and blah, blah, blah. And so it just sort of made me, it was so interesting, because actually, you know, if we could do that in life, if we could take all the toxicity away and just sort of say, right, you've had a bad day, you're sort of, you know, you want to have a good old, you know, whatever. but you probably don't think there's anyone behind this email address. But there's me, and I'm going to take you seriously, and I'm going to write you, you know, I wish I had time to do that to everyone, and you don't. But, you know, it was a sort of interesting lesson for me that actually sometimes people just need to sort of hear that you're listening, and we take these things seriously, you know. That there will be lots of people furious with every interruption, and there will be people screaming at the television because you didn't pick up a politician for something that they said that, you know, was manifestly untrue. And so somehow in the crazy whirl of your news mind, you're constantly trying to hear both voices. Did I interrupt too much? Oh no, I let him get away with something. Oh no, I should have interrupted. Oh, I shouldn't have interrupted. You know, so I think that never ever leaves you, which is why you sort of, you know, you end the week exhausted.
But I think we all crave connection. I think that's a really great example there. You know, I think we all try to reply to people who come to us directly. And I realise you have so many, but that's brilliant. I do think talking and trying to mediate is perhaps something we need to think about more. And going into the American election, will you be covering the 2020 election? And what are your fears and hopes about that going into this year's cycle? Are you going to be travelling to America? Well, I suppose we don't know.
I mean, look, you know, I would right now have just been finishing the Democratic Convention in Wisconsin, which was the 13th. Funny enough, you know, there was the silver lining. I would have missed my son's 16th birthday. So in a way, the whole thing was cancelled. I'm here. But it was 4 years ago, it was a real moment. The conventions were extraordinary. We covered the convention in Cleveland for the Republican Party, and then we drove through Pennsylvania, and we went to Philadelphia for the Democrats convention, and I spent a lot of time on the ground. And it was absolutely invaluable to how you see a story and how you cover it, and just the conversations you have with people. And you know, I think back there was a sort of naivety even then to sort of how we covered the story, and I'm itching to get my teeth into it this time round. And I think the big question is, when do we go? You know, I've had the chance to make a film there in July, but I don't think, you know, it's a very sensible time to be going. I hope that it'll be okay by September. So I'm expecting to spend some of September, October, and then be there for the election in November. But yeah, I mean, honestly, the big worry is, does it even happen? And do we get to, do I have anything to bring to the table, you know, when it does? Because we haven't had that sense of the sort of build up. It'll be a very different, I mean, that's the interesting thing. It'll be a very, very different election. Each election is its own beast, and it's fascinating for that reason. And you know, who would have thought? We couldn't have predicted that. January, I went and I covered the Iowa caucus and the impeachment, and then I went back for the Super Tuesday, you know, in March, and that was it. And then it suddenly all just ended. And so I feel like I sort of crammed all my understanding of the first bit of the campaign into 2 months, and hopefully we'll get to pick up after the summer. But yeah, it's a complicated one, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite an extraordinary moment. And in fact, I'm gonna finish asking questions to you, and then I'm going to go to the viewers' questions. But Emily, what's the most surprising thing about broadcasting through lockdown? Have you enjoyed it? Has it been extraordinary? Has it been mundane?
What's the most surprising thing about? Well, I suppose lockdown itself was extraordinary. So I mean, before you even get to broadcasting, I think I learned things about myself actually during lockdown. And I say this very aware of, you know, the privilege of, you know, being at home with my family, with a garden, and actually, touch wood, you know, not having had illness in the family, and not obviously not working on the front line. But, you know, that the simplicity has been sort of thrilling for me, actually, just being able to, I think I'm surprised. I loved being told what to do. You can have 1 hour of exercise, or you can go out once a day and then go home. And I was never bored. I loved that sense of, I really enjoy my own company, which, I mean, obviously, you know, with my my poor family as well. But I never felt, oh my God, I'm being stopped from doing this, or stopped from going out there, or I didn't feel like that at all. So that was a massive sort of I sort of want to hold on to that as much as I can going forward. I want to clear out all the rubbish and the sort of periphery stuff and just say, I really enjoy work. Work felt more intense and home felt more intense. In terms of broadcasting, it was harder to do more interviews like this down the line, because one of the things that I love, and it just makes all the difference, is, you know, when you're sitting in a room with somebody, you have that connection. It all goes back to the human connection, doesn't it? You know, you get somebody's twinkle in their eye, you get their expression, you can see their body language or their tapping foot, and it tells you so much. And you can also steer a conversation much more easily, because down the line, you know, I'm sure like you're probably thinking, oh, shut up, you know, or we should finish this answer because I only want to come in. And it's hard because, you know, you interrupt somebody down the line, you get told you're rude, or you've cut them off or whatever. Whereas in the studio together, it's so much more approachable. You know, you can just sort of put up a hand, and it's much more natural, it's much more human. So I've massively missed that, and we've missed having the space of the big studio, because we're now on in the 10 o'clock news studio, and we don't have our own camera operators, camera people, and we don't have our sofas, and we don't have that sense of like we're a late night gathering, you know, because of the sort of physical restrictions. So that's been a shame, but I've quite enjoyed it. I think it's been good that I've still gone out to work. I mean, I think it's been good, you know, good for me to feel that I had out and back. And it's been good for my family that, you know, the boys all get really excited. They're like, have you got work today? And I go, yeah. And they go, yeah, because they realise that means they can spend all day on the machines and there'll be nobody to sort of beat them with a broom around the house. So yeah, so I suppose that would be my sense. And actually, you know, the enormity of the story, you always feel you have to kind of rise to it, and you have to give value, and you have to make, I mean, I've been just incredibly proud of the work that the team has done during this whole time, you know, on all the kind of investigations and on all the stuff that we were hopefully, you know, bringing to light. So it felt like, you know, we weren't wasting our time.
That's great, thank you. I'm actually back in the office, as you can see, because I miss it so much.
Exactly. I thought that was your home. It's a lovely time.
No, my post-industrial home.
Yeah.
I'm going to move to the questions now, of which I've got loads, so we won't get through all of them. Can we ever believe what comes out of a politician's mouth, Emily? I think this goes back to our earlier conversation about charity. And
look, of course, I hope so. You know what? Yeah. We all want politicians to succeed, right? That's the basic thing. They guide our life and they legislate, and so we want them to be doing the right thing. And I think to assume that all politicians are lying is just as ridiculous as to assume that all politicians are always, you know, saying the truth. I think, you know, we understand they're humans, and I think the point is that you know, we keep the more human they are, the better for everyone. So I don't want politicians to come in here and think, oh, you know, she's going to think that everything I'm saying is a lie. That's stupid. The best conversations that you ever have is with somebody who you can just go, really? You know, because actually you get more out of them with a raised eyebrow sometimes than you do by badgering, because people hear themselves and they want to be the human voice, and they want to be believable. And I think the best politicians are the ones who manage to make you feel like they're telling you something for the first time, you know, and you sort of, you know, you want it to be a conversation. I don't want to speak to a sort of a PR bot.
do you reckon that the pandemic has made us all a bit more human? Have you noticed any, sorry, this is my question,
Yeah.
Have you noticed any change in your interactions with politicians?
I don't know if it has. I think there was a moment when we thought, as we always do, you know, as we did with the financial crash, I think we thought that it would, you know, this will change everything. You know, the pandemic will change everything, or the financial crash will change everything, or, you know, the death of Joe Cox will change everything. There are those moments where you think, as you were saying earlier, that they're going to be sort of seminal, shifting sort of paradigms. And actually the extraordinary thing is I think we sort of we go back, you know, we do go back. Maybe I should say it's too early to know. You know, maybe that's the honest thing. I think I definitely, you know, apart from saying that I think politicians have been, you know, much happier to come into the studio now because they see it as a night out. I don't know, actually. I think we're sort of feeling our way in that. Maybe that's one to come back to in 6 months.
Feeling our way in that and many things, I think. How can the integrity of news reporting be maintained? The world now has to deal with not only fake news, but even fake journalists.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way I want to say it's good for a program like Newsnight because our style hasn't really changed. You know, we check our facts, we work towards data, we you know, we go as much as we can with the information that we have, and we dig when we haven't got enough information. And so in a way, I think what's happened is there is a hunger for people to kind of go, I don't understand that, you know, what were the regulations, or where are the real numbers, or don't give me those numbers, give me the excess death numbers, and then I'll be able to put it into a context, you know, myself. And so I think in a way Newsnight has, like the FT, you know, has gone for this sort of what I'd call second layer. You don't just sort of say the headline, you say this is what we're saying, and everything we're saying is backed up by, you know, the report, the data, the curve, the way it's done. And so on the one hand, it puts a huge amount of pressure on you to get that data and get that storytelling right and the balance. But I think it also means that we hopefully offer something more substantial to the viewers, in the sense that, you know, they sort of they realize we put ourselves through the mill. We've rung everything 6 different ways before it sort of goes on.
Is there a day at work or an interview that you especially remember as being the highlight of your career to date? There's so many in the book. Have there been any since then?
I mean, God, it's funny. Even since I've written the book, you know, we had Raheem Sterling just sort of amazingly sort of doing this, sort of coming to Newsnight for his first interview to talk about the whole sort of systemic racism of the way sort of football management's structured. And it was great. It was just, you know, not only did I finally get kudos with my sons, but it's just lovely that somebody like, you know, a serious top flight, yeah, athlete, footballer, just sportsman could come to us and say, Newsnight's the place to tell my story. Robert De Niro did that a month ago. And we were just like, I remember the editor saying, we've got Robert De Niro. And I was like, what for? I was like, really? And I sort of, I was like, what's the film? And it was like, no film. I was like, what's the book? What's the charity? What's the cause? No charity. He just wants to speak to Newsnight. Yeah, he likes you. Okay, great. So there is a moments where you sort of think, this is really nice. We're sort of, we're hearing from people that have sort of come towards us because they like what we're doing on the programme. In terms of moments, I mean, one of the moments I go back to, funnily enough, and I guess, you know, everyone would expect me to say that the royal interview, but actually it was sort of earlier than that. It was 2 years earlier. And one of the big problems that we always have is you do this great interview, and then on Newsnight or, you know, on any programme, you cut it down to sort of 6 minutes, and you sort of shed tears for all the bits that are on the cutting floor. And you end up thinking, why have we cut that? And why have we done that? And we've missed out the best bits and, you know, all the rest of it. And I did an interview with Emma Thompson during the Harvey Weinstein scandal. And she was so good and so powerful and so lucid and so actually, frankly, inspiring. And I called up my editor of the day and I was like, oh my God, it's so good. It's all so good. But I don't know which bits to cut, you know. And he just said, let's run all of it then. And that was a seminal moment for me, because that's what you can do with Newsnight. You know, if you have something great, that was a massive learning curve. Don't treat Emma Thompson like she's the celebrity end bit that gets 6 minutes. If she's saying something that speaks to, you know, women's experience, to abuse in Hollywood, to power and the way, you know, you speak truth to power, just run it. And it was such an amazing sort of awakening for me. And it was a male editor who just said, if it's a great interview, let's run it for 20 minutes. And we ran it for 20 minutes. And it was a sort of changing point, because we think we live in this world where, Twitter is 270 characters, and people like a meme and that lasts 30 seconds. And actually what we rediscovered was, with our audience, there is a massive appetite for good, long, intelligent chat and discussion, and it was a good thing to do. It was it made her feel good, it made us feel good that we hadn't sort of wasted an interview. And it just showed that actually with a good piece of television, it doesn't need to be bells and whistles and all the rest of it. People just want to listen to a sort of a good interview.
That's really heartening that people do have the appetite for that longer interview. And in fact, on that, somebody's asking, how do you prepare for big interviews? So do you have a team of researchers, or is it you and Google?
It's both. So I think how do I prepare? I over prepare is the truth. I sit there like some big fat girly swat with my, marker pens out, and I've got all my, highlighters, and this was, goes back to 1977, and this was 1982. And so I literally kind of, I try and make sure that I have a chronology of dates and places and names so that I know exactly where things fit into the story, because sometimes you can have got the sort of tenor right, but you get tripped up on, so, oh, no, Emily, it wasn't 2012, it was 2010. And if you get something like that wrong in the middle of an interview, it throws you because you think it makes you look unresearched. We've got brilliant people on the team in Newsnight, and proper forensic. So they will cross-check pictures. They will, say, has this picture been altered? Is there a chance that this person wasn't really in the shot when we were looking at that? Do we have any witnesses to say that they were in that place when they said they were there? I suppose it has a bit the sense of a sort of a legal courtroom, in the sense that you want to make sure you're as watertight as you can be on that sort of stuff. And I love being able to role play. So I always get whoever's done the brief to really fire back at me and be awful or ghastly, or say, well, Emily, it's all very well for you to say that, blah blah blah. And I'm saying, harder. Come on, I want to feel that I'm quaking with what you're. Put me on my toes, and I'll see if I can sort of find my feet in this one. So I suppose my answer is probably I would say you can't prepare too much. I'm sure you can. But I think I prefer to have too much paper, too many highlighter pens, too many sort of dates and place and all the rest of it, and then throw that out. And I suppose the last thing I'd say, particularly for sort of young journalists watching this, is the thing that you have to respect is what I call this void of silence for 5 minutes, where you shut down all the other voices. So there'll be a moment where somebody goes, you must ask that, and don't forget to ask that, and you should do that, and have you got that, and did you remember that date, and have you got that? And then you just need to sort of put your hands against your ears and go into a really quiet place where you just think, what's this about? Like, what am I actually asking? What's this about? And that's where you find the voice, I think, of the interview. Otherwise, you just got a load of facts and dates and places, and you haven't got anything that sort of speaks to the sort of body of the interview itself.
Thank you. There's loads of advice there for me, actually, for my
I think
no in my interviewing. But this is a really interesting one. I think this might have to be the last question. Have you had to experience many setbacks in your career? If so, how did you overcome them and maintain belief in yourself?
Yes, I mean, I'd say that setbacks in the sense that I'm trying to think if I've yes, I suppose, I've let me think about that. I would say that every time you do an interview that doesn't work, or that, that sort of really, that throws you, you take that as a personal setback. I remember once it was my son's 3rd birthday, and stupidly, Muggins here was like, I'm gonna, I've said I'll work, and I can't be the stay-at-home mom. I was sort of, paranoid about being the sort of giving off the wrong image, and I mustn't be the mum with a toddler. You carry all that sort of baggage around with you, stupidly, I think, but maybe inevitably when you start on a program like Newsnight. And so I was sort of trying to be tougher and more macho and all the rest of it. And so I sort of, you know, literally farmed the kid out to his friend on his own birthday to go to somebody else's party. And then I went into the studio and I did probably the worst discussion ever, which was on you know, the sort of Israel-Palestinian cause, and we had sort of two guests who just sort of yelled at each other, and I didn't manage to control it very well. And it was Friday the 13th, of course. You know, his birthday's on the 13th of July, and so I came away just thinking, okay, I've got to learn from that. Not only was it a terrible interview, but my head was in the wrong place. I feel guilty as a mother, and I didn't like the person that I was trying to be, which is like, you know, that doesn't matter. I can sort of box that mind and all the rest of it. So I'd say, I mean, it's not a setback in the sense that, you know, the house burned down or you know, whatever. And I think you have to be prepared for sort of, honestly, all that to come. I feel like I live in a world of perpetual catastrophe fantasizing, where I'm always imagining the worst is about to happen. And I always feel incredibly grateful when, you know, on one day it doesn't. I think it's a Jewish gene. I've never really got past that. But I say all those are setbacks, you know, all those are setbacks where you sort of, you know, you kick yourself and you don't like yourself and you think, how did I get that so wrong? And, you know, I was at Sky News. I mean, this is ages and ages ago. I was at Sky News and I said the word bugger on air. And I remember the head of news, John Riley, coming over to me and just saying, have you ever heard a newsroom go completely silent? It was awful. And I offered my resignation straight away because I was so sort of mortified and humiliated. I was just like, it's easier if I'm just not here. It was my way of making the trap doors open and just, you know, let the earth swallow me up. And I think he was smiling, but I didn't see the smile. I just remember feeling mortified with that. And actually, I stayed, and you recover, but it's probably something that everyone in the newsroom still remembers, but, you know, kind enough not to message me about the whole time. And so all these things are sort of, you know, they're setbacks, which the grace of time allows you to laugh about them. But at the time, I remember just feeling awful. And, you know, shortly after that, I went on a walking holiday with my husband, and we were having these. It sounds like Theresa May. I'm not about to call an election, but we were sort of trekking all around the Dolomites. It was absolutely gorgeous, and we hadn't seen any news and anything. And so on the last night, he was like, "Great news! There's a TV in this hotel." And I was like, "Great!" And he's like, "But the bad news is it's Sky." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm going to get palpitations again." And so it was a sort of. All these things are, I suppose, the things that you learn about yourself. You know, that's what the book was. That was can you exorcise, you know, the demons and the sort of terrible moments that that have you waking up in a cold fear at night. And I suppose, you know, that never goes away. I never stopped doing that, but I've understood it now. I've understood that there will be terrible things that you know, that feel like they've knocked you sideways, and then the next day you'll get nominated for a BAFTA and you'll go, oh, that's fine, we got nominated for a BAFTA, you know. So it's a bit of everything.
Well, Emily, thank you so much. I thank you for putting all those experiences down in Airhead. It's a fantastic ride, and if you want to buy it from Fox Lane Books, independent booksellers, a slide will be coming up in a minute. And thank you so much for your time today. I've just loved talking to you. It's been wonderful, and good luck as we move into the next phase of this pandemic and the election, and we'll all be watching it with our whiskies at 10:30. Thanks very much, Emily.
Bye-bye.
Well, goodness me, what a way to finish the York Festival of Ideas. That was truly spectacular. An interesting theme that emerged yet again in so many of our events is the need in this strange time that we're living in to be empathetic to each other. We started off the festival hoping that we would deliver something that might break down some social isolation. We know there are lots of you who are watching these events are doing so on your own, that you're shielding and so on. So I hope very much that the 1997 and now 98 with this event has enlivened you and inspired you. We've had nearly 42,000 people watching the variety of York Festival of Ideas events. I feel very certain that after this evening's event with Emily and Isabel, that number is going to rise and rise. So thank you again. We hope very much to see you again in 2021, perhaps not just on a Zoom platform, but certainly the idea of a virtual and a physical festival is something that we're now going to embrace, and we hope to see you in one dimension or another next year. Thank you very much from the York Festival of Ideas and all of our team. Thank you.